Sometimes the best deals in life come from desperate men with secrets they don't even know they're keeping. Sometimes a single dollar can change everything. In the dusty town of Copper Ridge, Silas Jones was a broke ranch hand with empty pockets and fewer prospects. When a sweating stranger offered him 3 donkeys for $1 silver, Silas figured he was getting pack animals on the cheap. The stranger insisted the beasts were cursed and had to keep their heads covered, or they'd go mad. Silas didn't believe in curses, but he believed in a bargain. What he found hidden in those canvas hoods would turn his simple life upside down and put him square in the crosshairs of the most dangerous outlaws in the territory. What would you do if a $1 gamble suddenly made you the richest and most hunted man in the West? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had already dropped behind the western ridge when Silas Jones pushed through the batwing doors of the Copper Ridge Saloon. At 53 years old, his face bore the deep lines and weathered texture of old saddle leather, each crease telling a story of hard work under an unforgiving sun. His hands, scarred and calloused from 30 years of working other men's cattle, moved with the deliberate economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion meant wasted energy. The boots on his feet were worn through at the heels, the leather cracked and faded from years of use. His shirt had been mended so many times that distinguishing the original fabric from the patches required close examination. In his pocket, wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth to keep it from wearing against the seam, sat a single silver dollar. That coin represented the sum total of 3 months' wages from the Henderson Ranch, and it was all the money Silas had in the world. The saloon carried the familiar smells that marked every frontier drinking establishment from Montana to Mexico, tobacco smoke hanging heavy in the air, the sharp tang of spilled whiskey soaking into floorboards that had absorbed decades of the stuff, and that particular combination of sweat and leather that came from men who spent their days in the saddle and their evenings trying to forget about tomorrow's work. Silas had been coming to this place for more than 20 years, ever since he'd first arrived in Copper Ridge, as a young man full of ambitions that never quite found their footing in reality. He knew every stain on the floor, every nick and gouge in the long wooden bar, every face that turned toward him as he entered. Most of those faces were friendly enough, or at least not hostile. Silas Jones was known throughout the territory as an honest man, someone who kept his word and paid his debts when circumstances allowed. He was the kind of worker that ranchers valued, reliable, skilled with animals, able to handle the hard labor that came with maintaining a cattle operation in rough country. But honest and hard-working were qualities that didn't necessarily translate to prosperous, not in a territory where the good land belonged to men with money and family connections, and where ranch hands like Silas were viewed as interchangeable parts, as disposable as used horseshoes once they'd served their purpose. "Evening, Slick," Tom Brennan called out from behind the bar. The nickname had attached itself to Silas back in his early 20s, when he'd been better with a rope than any man in 3 counties. He could drop a loop over a running steer's horns at 30 yards, could tie knots that held through any weather, could splice and repair tack with a speed and precision that drew admiring comments from older hands who'd been working cattle since before Silas was born. That particular skill had faded with the years as arthritis settled into his joints and his reflexes slowed, but the name remained, a gentle reminder of better days that felt increasingly distant. "Tom," Silas nodded, making his way to the bar. He didn't order anything. Everyone in the saloon understood the arithmetic of poverty, well enough not to make things awkward by offering drinks he couldn't afford, or by asking questions that would force him to admit just how tight his circumstances had become. "Henderson let you go?" Tom asked, wiping down the bar with a rag that had seen cleaner days, and probably wouldn't see many more before it fell apart completely. "Contract ended," Silas said simply, his voice carrying no particular emotion. "He's bringing in his nephew from Kansas City to take over the day-to-day operation, wants family running things, which I suppose makes sense from his perspective." Tom nodded slowly, his expression sympathetic but not surprised. It was a common enough story in these parts, repeated with minor variations across every ranch and every town. The old ways were changing, sometimes slowly, and sometimes with the sudden brutality of a late spring storm. Men like Silas, skilled and experienced but aging, reliable but expensive to keep on through the lean winter months when there was less work to be done, were being replaced by younger blood, by family connections, or increasingly by the kind of mechanized equipment that was starting to show up on the larger spreads, metal contraptions that could do the work of 3 men and never complained about wages or working conditions. "You got prospects?" Tom asked, already knowing the answer but asking anyway, because that's what you did when a man was down on his luck. Silas shrugged, a gesture that conveyed volumes without committing to anything specific. "Always prospects out there somewhere. Question is whether any of them amount to anything worth pursuing." The truth was considerably harder than that casual reply suggested, but Silas wasn't in the habit of burdening other people with his problems. At 53, with a back that complained about cold weather and hands that ached whenever rain was coming, he was running out of ranches, willing to take him on for anything more than occasional day labor. The younger men could work longer hours without tiring, could lift heavier loads without risking injury, and they didn't need as much pay to get by because most of them still had their health and their futures ahead of them. Silas had been making the rounds for 3 weeks now, visiting every ranch within 2 days' ride, and every foreman had given him the same polite refusal. Variations on, "We'll keep you in mind if something opens up," which everyone understood was just another way of saying, "Don't hold your breath, old-timer." The batwing doors swung open with their characteristic squeak, and a stranger entered. That alone was enough to draw attention in a place like Copper Ridge. The town wasn't exactly on the main routes between anywhere important, and most of the faces in the saloon on any given evening were familiar ones. Local ranchers, their hired hands, the occasional traveling merchant who'd gotten turned around and ended up here by accident. This man was different in ways that immediately set him apart. He wore a city suit that must have cost real money when it was new, though it had clearly seen hard travel recently. The fabric was dusty and stained, the collar wilted, one sleeve torn at the elbow. His face was pale despite the outdoor life that seemed to have brought him here, and his skin gleamed with sweat even though the evening air had turned cool. His eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal, searching desperately for an escape route that probably didn't exist. He made his way to the bar with shoulders hunched forward, moving like a man trying to make himself smaller and less noticeable, which had exactly the opposite effect in a room full of people who'd learned to read body language as a matter of survival. He ordered whiskey in a voice that trembled slightly, the words barely loud enough to carry to Tom behind the bar. Tom poured without comment, his face professionally neutral, and the stranger downed the drink in one continuous gulp. He immediately pushed the glass forward and ordered another, his hand shaking enough that the glass rattled against the wood. Silas watched from the corner of his eye, his instincts honed by decades of reading both men and livestock telling him that something was badly wrong with this fellow. The stranger wasn't just nervous, he was terrified. And terrified men did unpredictable things, which meant it was wise to pay attention and be ready to move if the situation turned dangerous. The second whiskey went down almost as fast as the first, and then the stranger turned to survey the room more carefully. His gaze swept across the assembled drinkers and card players, lingering briefly on each face as if he were conducting some kind of assessment or looking for something specific. When his eyes landed on Silas, they stuck there. For a long moment that felt uncomfortable in its intensity, the two men regarded each other across the smoky interior of the saloon. The stranger seemed to be making some kind of calculation, weighing options and possibilities that Silas couldn't see or understand. You look like a man who knows animals, the stranger said finally, his voice carrying a slight accent that Silas couldn't quite place. Eastern, probably. Educated. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd spent time in schools rather than on ranches. I've worked with my share, Silas replied carefully, keeping his tone neutral and his expression unrevealing. Donkeys? Mules, donkeys, horses, oxen. Most anything with 4 legs and a stubborn streak. Why do you ask? The stranger licked his lips nervously, his tongue darting out like a lizard testing the air. I have 3 donkeys. Good animals, strong and healthy. I need to sell them. Tonight. Right now, actually. I can't wait until morning. Silas raised an eyebrow. Selling livestock in a saloon is a new approach. Most folks use the livestock yards, or at least wait for daylight so buyers can see what they're getting. I'm in a difficult situation, the stranger said, and that much was painfully obvious from his entire demeanor. I need to travel fast and light. Can't take the animals with me. I'm willing to let them go for practically nothing just to be rid of them. How much is practically nothing? $1. The saloon had been maintaining a low buzz of conversation, the usual evening mix of gossip and complaints and stories that got more elaborate with each telling. But at those words, the noise level dropped significantly. 3 donkeys for $1 wasn't a bargain. It was either some kind of joke, or it was a trap of some kind. Or the animals were so diseased or vicious that they weren't worth the rope it would take to lead them anywhere. Good pack animals sold for $20 to $30 each in the current market, sometimes considerably more if they were particularly well-trained or exceptionally strong. Offering 3 for a single dollar meant something was desperately, fundamentally wrong with either the animals or the situation. What's the catch? Silas asked, because there was always a catch when something seemed too good to be true. The stranger's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Silas, then down to the bar, then back to Silas again. His pupils were dilated, and a vein pulsed visibly in his temple. They're cursed, he said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper that somehow carried through the suddenly quiet room. Someone at a nearby table laughed, a sharp bark of amusement that was quickly stifled. The stranger didn't seem to notice or care. He leaned closer to Silas, close enough that Silas could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the fine tremor that ran through his entire body. I'm serious about this. The previous owner told me they're possessed by some kind of spirit, something dark and violent. They can't be allowed to see sunlight or they go mad with rage. That's why they have to wear the hoods at all times. As long as the hoods stay on and they can't see, they're calm as can be. But if you remove those hoods during daylight hours, they'll go completely wild. Might kill someone, might kill everyone nearby. Silas studied the man's face with the careful attention he'd give to a horse he was considering buying. The stranger believed what he was saying. That much was absolutely clear from his expression and his body language. Whether the curse was actually real or just a story someone had fed him was another question entirely. But the man's fear was genuine. Where are they now? Silas asked. Tied up behind the livery stable. I can take you there right now, this very moment. $1, and they're yours. Animals, rope, feed bags, everything I've got with them. I just need them gone so I can leave this town. Silas thought about it, running through the calculations in his head. He needed pack animals if he was going to strike out on his own for a while, maybe do some prospecting or trapping up in the high country until he could find another ranch position. 3 donkeys, even if there was something genuinely odd about them, would be useful for that kind of work. And he had exactly $1 to his name, which meant this was quite possibly the only opportunity he'd have to acquire pack animals before his money ran out completely. Let me see them first, Silas said. I'm not buying anything sight unseen, curse or no curse. The stranger nodded eagerly, his relief at finding a potential buyer almost palpable. Of course. That's only reasonable. Come with me right now, please. They left the saloon together, drawing curious and speculative stares from the other patrons. Tom Brennan caught Silas's eye as they headed for the door and gave him a warning look that clearly communicated concern. But Silas just nodded in acknowledgement. He'd been around long enough and had seen enough of life to handle whatever this situation turned out to be. And if it did turn dangerous, well, he'd faced down plenty of dangerous situations before and was still here to talk about it. The livery stable sat at the east end of town, a large timber structure that smelled powerfully of hay and horse manure and leather and all the other scents that accumulated around working animals. Behind the main building, in a small corral made of split-rail fencing, stood 3 donkeys. Even in the dim light of early evening, with shadows lengthening across the ground, Silas could see they were good animals. They had solid builds that suggested strength and endurance, their coats looked healthy and well-maintained, and their overall condition indicated they'd been properly fed and cared for. These weren't neglected or abused creatures. And each one wore a thick canvas hood that covered its entire head, from ears to shoulders, completely blocking any view of their surroundings. "See?" the stranger said, his voice carrying a mixture of vindication and continued fear. "The hoods keep them calm. As long as they stay on, the animals are fine. But you must never, never remove them during daylight hours." Silas approached the fence slowly, moving with the calm deliberation that animals responded to. The donkeys didn't react to his presence with any sign of alarm or aggression. They just stood there peacefully, occasionally shifting their weight from one foot to another or flicking an ear toward some sound only they could hear. Silas climbed over the fence and walked up to the nearest donkey, keeping his movements smooth and predictable. He ran his hand along the animal's flank, feeling the muscle and fat beneath the coat. This was no neglected or mistreated creature. The donkey's coat was clean and well brushed, its body healthy and strong. "How long have you had them?" Silas asked, continuing his examination. 2 days, the stranger said from the other side of the fence. "Bought them from a fellow down in Red Creek. He told me about the curse. Said his brother had owned them before him and lost 3 fingers when one of them went crazy after the hood accidentally came off in sunlight. He was very specific about the danger." Silas didn't believe in curses or supernatural possession. He'd lived too long and seen too much of the world's natural wonders and natural horrors to think that donkeys could be inhabited by evil spirits. But he absolutely believed in frightened men and strange circumstances, and this whole situation had the distinct smell of trouble of the human variety rather than the supernatural kind. Still, there was no denying these were quality animals, and the price was certainly right. "You got papers for them?" Silas asked. "Bills of sale? Any kind of documentation about ownership?" "No papers," the stranger said quickly. "Look, friend, I'm not trying to trick you or cheat you. I just desperately need to get rid of them and get out of this town tonight. If you don't want them, I'll find someone else who will, but I'd really prefer to settle this right now." That was probably true enough. At this price, somebody would take the animals regardless of any stories about curses, and Silas genuinely did need pack animals for the work ahead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his carefully wrapped silver dollar, feeling the weight of it in his hand one last time before committing to this decision. "All right," he said. "We have a deal." The stranger's relief was palpable and immediate. He practically snatched the coin from Silas's extended hand, as if afraid the offer might be withdrawn, then quickly handed over the 3 lead ropes that were tied to the fence. "Remember what I told you," he said urgently. "Don't take off the hoods during daylight. Wait until full dark, and then be very careful. These animals are dangerous if they can see." "I'll manage," Silas said, gathering the lead ropes. The stranger was already backing away toward the street, clutching his single dollar like it was a life preserver thrown to a drowning man. "Good luck to you," he called over his shoulder, and then he was hurrying away into the gathering darkness, moving so fast he was practically running. Silas stood there in the corral with his 3 hooded donkeys, wondering what exactly he'd just bought into. The animals seemed calm enough under their strange coverings, their breathing steady, and even beneath the heavy canvas. He gathered all 3 lead ropes in one hand and started walking them toward the old abandoned corral on the outskirts of town, a ramshackle place where he sometimes kept temporary livestock when he was between ranch jobs and needed somewhere to stable an animal for a few days. The walk took about 20 minutes through streets that were mostly empty at this hour, with only a few people visible here and there. The donkeys followed docilely enough, their small hooves making a steady clip-clop sound on the hard-packed dirt road. They seemed perfectly comfortable wearing the hoods, not fighting against them or showing any signs of distress. When they reached the old corral, Silas led them inside through a gate that hung slightly crooked on leather hinges and secured it behind them. There was a water trough that still held clean water from the recent rains, and he filled some feed buckets with grain he kept stored in a shed nearby for occasions like this. The donkeys found the grain easily enough, even with their hoods on, which suggested there must be openings for breathing and eating built into the canvas coverings. They stood side by side at the feed buckets, munching contentedly, while Silas watched them and tried to puzzle out the situation. The hoods themselves were strange when you really looked at them, much heavier and more substantial than they needed to be for simple blindfolds. The canvas was thick and appeared to be layered, almost like it had been quilted or padded with something between the outer surface and the inner lining. The moon was rising now over the eastern hills, bright and nearly full, casting enough light to see by clearly. Full dark, the stranger had said. Well, it was certainly dark enough now for Silas's purposes, and his curiosity about these supposedly cursed animals had grown to the point where he needed answers. He approached the nearest donkey slowly, speaking in the low, calm voice he'd always used with animals throughout his working life. "Easy now, friend. Let's just see what we're dealing with here. Nothing to be afraid of." His hands found the edge of the hood where it fastened beneath the donkey's jaw with a simple leather buckle. It was easy enough to work loose if you knew what you were doing. Despite himself, despite his rational skepticism about curses and supernatural forces, Silas found himself expecting some kind of dramatic reaction. The stranger's fear had been so genuine that it had planted a seed of doubt, a small voice in the back of his mind, wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something to the story after all. The buckle came free, and the hood slipped off easily. The donkey just stood there, blinking in the moonlight with large, gentle eyes. No madness, no violence, no sign of supernatural possession. Just a calm, ordinary donkey looking around at its surroundings with mild interest before going back to its grain. Silas removed the other 2 hoods with exactly the same result. 3 perfectly normal animals, now free to see their surroundings, going about their business without any drama whatsoever. So much for curses, Silas muttered to himself, shaking his head at his own momentary credulity. He picked up one of the discarded hoods, turning it over in his hands and examining it more closely in the moonlight. The weight of it continued to puzzle him. Canvas shouldn't be this heavy, even thick canvas. He ran his fingers over the surface, feeling the texture of the fabric and the way it seemed to have distinct layers. There was definitely something in there, sandwiched between the outer layer and the inner lining. Silas pulled out his pocket knife, an old, bone-handled blade that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before that, one of the few things of value he still owned. He carefully worked the tip into the seam of the hood where the stitching held the layers together. The thread was tight and well done, but not impossible to pick apart if you worked patiently. He spent several minutes carefully loosening the stitches and finally managed to open up a section of the inner lining about 6 inches long. Something white showed through the gap he'd created, paper of some kind. Silas widened the opening with his fingers and pulled out what looked like a large sheet of thick, high-quality paper stock. But this definitely wasn't ordinary paper. Even in the moonlight, he could clearly see the intricate engraving work covering the surface, the official-looking borders and seals, the precise numbering in the corners. It was an uncut sheet of treasury notes, brand new bills that had never been separated from each other, never been put into circulation, never been spent or traded or handled by anyone except whoever had printed them. Worth. Silas did some quick mental arithmetic, probably close to $200 per sheet, if the denominations were what they appeared to be. His hand started to shake slightly as he tore open more of the hood's lining with less patience and more urgency. More sheets of currency. Dozens of them, all carefully layered between the canvas like some kind of elaborate smuggling operation. He grabbed the second hood and ripped it open with even less care, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. More treasury notes, just as many as the first hood. The third hood yielded the same shocking results when he tore it apart. Silas sat down hard on the ground, his legs suddenly feeling unreliable and weak. He was holding a fortune in his hands, not just a small fortune. He was holding what had to be thousands and thousands of dollars in stolen money. Treasury notes didn't end up sewn into donkey hoods by accident or through any kind of legitimate business transaction. These had to be from the great train heist that everyone had been talking about 6 months ago, when masked men had stopped the Denver and Rio Grande train outside of Silver Falls and made off with a shipment of freshly printed currency that was being transported to various banks throughout the territory for distribution. The bandits had never been caught despite an extensive manhunt. The money had never been recovered despite rewards being offered and federal marshals combing the territory. Every lawman from here to Texas had been looking for it, asking questions, following leads that went nowhere, and now it was sitting in a pile at Silas Jones's feet, discovered purely by accident, because a nervous stranger had been in such a desperate hurry to get rid of 3 donkeys that he didn't even know the animals were carrying a king's ransom on their heads. Silas looked at the donkeys with new eyes. They gazed back at him placidly, still chewing their grain, completely unconcerned with the revelation that had just turned Silas's world upside down. "Well," Silas said softly to the night air and the oblivious animals, "this certainly complicates things considerably." The stranger had stolen the animals from the actual bandits. That was the only explanation that made any logical sense. He'd taken the donkeys, probably been told some elaborate story about curses, and keeping the hoods on to prevent him from discovering what was really hidden there, and then realized he was in way over his head. Maybe he'd started to suspect what he was carrying, or maybe he'd just panicked at being in possession of stolen property without understanding the full extent of it. Either way, he'd needed to unload the animals fast before whoever he'd stolen them from came looking. And now those men, the real bandits, the ones who'd committed the great train heist and killed at least 2 guards during the robbery, were probably already searching for their missing money when they figured out it had been sold for $1 to a broke ranch hand in Copper Ridge. They would come calling, and they wouldn't be polite about it. Silas gathered up the sheets of currency with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts at control. His mind raced through his limited options, examining each one and finding serious problems with all of them. He could turn the money in to the law, claim whatever finder's reward had been posted by the railroad or the federal government. But rewards were tricky things, often tied up in legal complications and bureaucratic procedures that could take months or even years to resolve. There was no guarantee he'd see a penny of any reward before the bandits tracked him down, and dead men didn't collect rewards no matter how legitimate their claims might be. He could try to spend the money, but these were uncut sheets of treasury notes. They'd need to be carefully separated along the perforated lines, and then very cautiously introduced into circulation through various transactions. Any bank or merchant would ask questions about where such pristine, obviously new currency had come from. Word would spread quickly, and that would bring attention from exactly the wrong kind of people. Or he could try to disappear completely, take the money, head up into the high country or across the territorial border, find some remote place to hide until things cooled down, and then figure out his next move. But disappearing wasn't as easy as it sounded when you were 53 years old, traveling with 3 distinctive pack animals and carrying something that dangerous men were desperately searching for. None of the options were good. All of them carried substantial risks. But one thing was absolutely certain in Silas's mind. The life he'd been living up until yesterday evening, the life of a tired ranch hand with $1 to his name and no real prospects for the future, was over. Finished. Done. For better or worse, everything had just changed in ways he was still struggling to fully comprehend. He looked up at the stars, bright and indifferent in the night sky. Somewhere out there in the darkness, dangerous men were probably just now realizing their fortune was missing. Somewhere closer, maybe already in town asking questions, the nervous stranger was discovering that $1 wasn't nearly enough payment for the trouble he'd just passed along to an unsuspecting buyer. Silas had bought himself 3 donkeys and a whole world of problems. The only question now was whether he was smart enough, tough enough, and lucky enough to survive what was coming. And luck had never been particularly generous to Silas Jones during his 53 years on this earth, which meant he couldn't count on it starting now when he needed it most. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain from the mountains. The donkeys continued eating their grain, completely oblivious to the weight of the decisions their new owner faced. And Silas sat there in the moonlight, surrounded by stolen money and impossible choices, wondering how a simple bargain made in a saloon had turned into the most complicated and dangerous moment of his entire life. He needed to think this through carefully, needed to make smart decisions instead of panicked ones. The bandits would come looking. That was inevitable. But they wouldn't know immediately where to search. The nervous stranger could be anywhere by now, probably riding hard for the territorial border. It might take the bandits days to track him down, and even longer to extract information about what he'd done with the donkeys. That gave Silas a window of time, perhaps a few days if he was lucky, to figure out his next move. The treasury notes needed to be hidden better than they were now. The torn canvas hoods lying on the ground would be an immediate giveaway to anyone who knew what to look for. Silas gathered them up and threw them into the corner of the shed, where old tack and broken equipment accumulated over time. Then he began the careful work of redistributing the currency throughout his gear in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious even to someone conducting a thorough search. He created false bottoms in the feed bags by carefully opening the stitching, inserting sheets of currency, and sewing them back up with thread he kept for mending tack. He rolled other sheets tightly and inserted them into the hollow wooden handles of tools in his pack, a hammer, a hatchet, a shovel with a removable handle. Some sheets went between layers of the blankets he kept for the animals, stitched in place so they wouldn't shift or rustle. A few went into the lining of his saddlebags, and others into a modified canteen that had a false bottom he'd created years ago for keeping emergency money safe from thieves. By the time the first grey light of dawn began creeping across the eastern horizon, Silas had transformed his windfall from an obvious pile of currency into something that looked like the ordinary gear and supplies of a traveling ranch hand. The donkeys wore simple rope halters now, nothing unusual or noteworthy about their appearance. To a casual observer, Silas Jones looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a down-on-his-luck working man heading out with his pack animals to try his fortune elsewhere. He allowed himself a few hours of sleep in the shed, his body demanding rest, even though his mind kept circling around his problems like a dog worrying a bone. When he woke to full daylight, stiff and sore from sleeping on hard-packed earth, his first thought was to get out of Copper Ridge as quickly as possible, but running immediately might draw exactly the kind of attention he was trying to avoid. People in small towns noticed changes in routine, noticed when someone left in an obvious hurry. Better to move at a normal pace, like a man who'd finished his business and was simply moving on to the next opportunity. He was checking the pack straps on the donkeys when he heard horses approaching along the road. 2 riders, moving at an easy pace that suggested they weren't in any particular hurry. Silas forced himself to continue working, to show no sign of alarm or concern, even as his heart rate picked up and his right hand instinctively moved closer to the old Colt revolver he kept tucked in his belt under his shirt. The riders pulled up outside the corral fence. They were young men, probably in their late 20s, dressed in the practical type working clothes of cowboys, but carrying themselves with an edge that Silas recognized immediately. These weren't ranch hands coming back from a night in town. These were men who'd seen violence and weren't strangers to dealing it out when circumstances required. The way they sat their horses, the way their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, the casual positioning of their hands near their weapons, all of it spoke to experience with trouble. "Morning," the taller of the 2 called out. He had a thin face with sharp features and cold eyes that reminded Silas of a snake he'd once seen swallowing a prairie dog. Patient, emotionless, absolutely committed to its purpose regardless of the struggles of its prey. "Morning," Silas replied, keeping his voice neutral and continuing to work on the pack straps. "Nice animals you got there," the shorter man said. He had a scar running from his left ear down to his jaw, the kind of mark left by a knife rather than an accident. His hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol, not quite a threat, but definitely a message. "Where'd you come by them?" "Bought them last night from a fellow in town," Silas said, keeping his attention on his work. "He was looking to sell, I was looking to buy. Worked out for both of us." "That so?" The tall man dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his entire life in the saddle. What did this fellow look like? Silas described the nervous stranger as accurately as he could, keeping his tone conversational and trying to sound like a man with nothing to hide and no particular stake in any larger drama. The 2 riders exchanged a glance that confirmed what Silas had already suspected. These men were looking for the donkeys, which meant they were connected to the robbery somehow. "He mention anything unusual about the animals?" the scarred man asked, still mounted but leaning forward in his saddle. "Said they were cursed," Silas replied truthfully. "Had some elaborate story about keeping their heads covered, or they'd go mad and violent. I figured he was just trying to justify selling them so cheap, maybe covering for some defect he didn't want to admit to. Low price, $1 for all 3. The tall man's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're telling me you bought 3 healthy donkeys for a single $1, and you didn't think that was suspicious? Didn't wonder what you were really getting into?" Silas shrugged, trying to project the mild bewilderment of an innocent man. "Fellow seemed desperate to leave town in a hurry. I needed pack animals and had exactly $1 to my name. Seemed like good timing for both of us. I've been around animals my whole life, and these looked sound enough despite the odd story. You take the hoods off." "First thing I did after I got them settled. Wanted to see if there was actually something wrong with them, or if it was just superstitious nonsense. Turns out they're fine. No curse, no madness, just regular donkeys that were being kept blind for no good reason I could figure." "What did you do with the hoods?" "Tossed them in the shed over yonder. Heavy old things. No use to me now that I know the animals don't need them." The tall man jerked his head towards the shed, and the scarred man dismounted and walked over to investigate. Silas kept his breathing steady and his hands busy with the pack straps, forcing himself not to watch too obviously. Everything depended on whether they believed his story, whether they'd accept that he was just an ignorant ranch hand who'd stumbled into a lucky deal without any understanding of what was really going on. The scarred man emerged from the shed a minute later, holding one of the empty, torn canvas hoods. He examined it carefully, running his fingers over the ripped seams where Silas had removed the currency the night before. The expression on his face went dark and angry. "They're empty," he called to his partner, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. The tall man's hand moved to his gun with the kind of smooth, practiced motion that comes from years of use. "Where's the money, old man?" Silas kept his voice confused and innocent, projecting genuine puzzlement. "What money? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play games with me. Those hoods were full of stolen currency. Now they're empty, and you're the only person who's touched them since the animals left our camp. So I'll ask you one more time. Where's the money? I don't know anything about stolen money, Silas said firmly. I saw 3 donkeys wearing heavy canvas hoods. I took the hoods off to check the animals. I threw the hoods aside because I didn't need them. If there was money sewn into them, it's news to me, and it's still in that shed somewhere, because I sure as hell don't have it. The scarred man was already back inside the shed, and Silas could hear him tearing the place apart, throwing things around, cursing steadily. The tall man kept his pistol trained on Silas now, not bothering to hide the threat anymore. His finger rested on the trigger, and his eyes had gone flat and cold. You're lying, he said flatly, and I don't appreciate being lied to. Search me if you want, Silas said, spreading his arms slightly. Search the animals. Search all my gear. You won't find any stolen money because I don't have any stolen money. I'm just a broke ranch hand who bought 3 donkeys. That's the whole story. The scarred man emerged from the shed again, his face red with anger and frustration. Nothing. The shed's clean. If the money was in there, it's gone now. The tall man studied Silas with those cold snake eyes for a long moment. You trying to tell me $50,000 just vanished into thin air overnight? I'm telling you I bought 3 donkeys for $1, took off some hoods that seemed unnecessary, and went about preparing for my trip. Whatever money you're talking about, I haven't seen it, don't have it, and don't know where it is. That's the truth. It was a dangerous game Silas was playing, and he knew it. These men were killers. He could see it in every line of their bodies, in every calculating glance they exchanged. They'd murdered for this money once already during the train heist, and they'd have no qualms whatsoever about putting a bullet in an old ranch hand who got in their way or tried to cheat them, but they were also uncertain. Silas had hidden the currency so thoroughly and cleverly that even a careful search wouldn't reveal it without literally tearing apart every single piece of gear, cutting open every bag, and dismantling every tool. That would take hours of work with no guarantee of finding anything. And if they killed him now, they might never figure out where the money had gone, assuming he actually had it at all, which they couldn't prove. The tall man's finger hovered near his trigger, and Silas could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Kill the old man and search everything anyway. Take him prisoner and try to make him talk or accept that maybe, just maybe, the money had disappeared some other way, and this ranch hand was telling the truth about being an innocent bystander. I think you're smarter than you look, old-timer, the tall man said finally. I think you found that money and hid it somewhere clever, and I think you're hoping we'll ride off and let you keep it. That about right? Think whatever you want, Silas said. But killing me won't get your money back if I don't actually have it, and searching this place properly will take you until sundown with no guarantee of finding anything. The standoff stretched out, tense and fragile as spring ice. Then the scarred man spoke up. We could take him with us, Jack. Make him talk somewhere quiet. Could do that, the tall man, apparently named Jack, agreed. But then we'd be traveling with a hostage, which draws attention we don't need. And if he really doesn't have the money, we've wasted time we can't afford to waste. He lowered his pistol slightly, though he didn't holster it completely. Here's how this is going to work, old man. We're going to ask around town about that fellow who sold you these donkeys. We're going to track him down and have a long conversation about what really happened. If it turns out he still had the money when he sold you the animals, then maybe you're telling the truth, and this is all just bad luck. But if we find out you're lying to us, if we discover you've got our money hidden somewhere, we'll be back. And next time, we won't be nearly so polite about asking questions. That seems fair enough, Silas said, though there was nothing remotely fair about any of this situation. The 2 men mounted their horses. Jack pointed at Silas with his free hand, the gesture carrying clear menace. Don't leave town. We see you trying to run with those animals. We'll know you're guilty and we'll hunt you down. Understand? I'm not running anywhere, Silas lied smoothly. I've got business to attend to here in town for a few more days." They rode off at a walk, but slowly, and Silas knew without any doubt that they'd be watching the roads leading out of Copper Ridge, watching for any sign that he was trying to escape with their money. He'd bought himself a little time with his performance, but not much. Once they failed to find the nervous stranger, who was certainly 50 miles away by now if he had any sense, they'd come back with harder questions and considerably less patience, and next time they might not come alone. Silas finished packing the donkeys with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't dare show any weakness. He had maybe a day, possibly 2 if he was very lucky. Then he'd need to be gone, vanished so completely that even determined and experienced hunters couldn't track him down. The question that occupied his mind as he worked was simple but crucial. Where could he possibly go that would be safe? Every road leading out of Copper Ridge would be watched now. Silas understood that with absolute certainty. Every obvious trail, every frequently traveled route, every place where a man might reasonably head with 3-pack animals would be under observation by Jack and his partner, and probably others they'd called in to help with the search. The bandits had substantial resources at their disposal. They'd pulled off one of the biggest robberies in territorial history, which meant they had planning skills, connections throughout the region, and most importantly, they had absolutely nothing to lose. Men who'd stolen $50,000 and killed to keep it weren't the type to give up just because the trail went cold for a few days. They'd keep searching until they either recovered their money or confirmed, beyond any doubt, that it was truly lost. Silas led the donkeys out of the corral and headed back toward the center of town, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who had legitimate business to conduct, and no particular reason to rush. His mind worked through the problem from every possible angle, examining options and discarding them almost as quickly as they occurred to him. He needed information about the bandits and their organization, about the law's ongoing search for the stolen money, about routes and destinations that might provide some measure of safety, and perhaps most critically, he needed help, though finding someone he could trust with this kind of dangerous secret seemed nearly impossible given the circumstances. As he walked down the main street of Copper Ridge with the 3 donkeys following placidly behind him, he noticed something that might have escaped his attention under different circumstances. A weathered poster was nailed to the wall outside the general store, its edges curled from sun and weather. He'd probably passed this same poster 100 times over the past months without really seeing it. But now he read it with new eyes and sudden, focused attention. Reward: $10,000 for information leading to the recovery of stolen United States Treasury currency, taken in the Silver Falls train robbery of March 18th. Contact Federal Marshal Thomas Garrett, Denver District Office, with any information regarding the whereabouts of the stolen funds or the identities of those responsible. $10,000. That was the posted reward for information, which meant whoever actually recovered the physical money might reasonably expect to receive significantly more than that amount. It also meant the federal government was taking this matter extremely seriously, serious enough to send marshals into the territory, serious enough to put substantial money behind the investigation, serious enough that someone in Washington had decided this case needed to be solved, regardless of the cost or effort required. An idea began forming in Silas's mind as he stood there studying the poster. It was dangerous, almost certainly foolish, and it depended on factors entirely outside his control. But it had one significant advantage over his other limited options. It might actually work. Instead of running blindly and hoping to stay ahead of the bandits, instead of trying to hide until things cooled down while carrying something that made him a perpetual target, he could go directly to the law, turn over the money, claim whatever reward was offered, and let the federal marshals deal with the very angry and dangerous men who were searching for it. The plan had obvious risks. The marshals might suspect him of being part of the original robbery. They might decide to hold him for questioning while they investigated his story, which would leave him vulnerable if the bandits tracked him down. The reward might be tied up in legal procedures for months or years, but at least it offered the possibility of getting out from under this burden with his life intact and maybe, just maybe, some honest money in his pocket at the end of it all. Silas tied the donkeys outside the general store and went inside. Martha Hendricks ran the establishment, a widow in her 60s who'd known Silas since he first arrived in Copper Ridge as a young man. She looked up from her ledger book when the bell above the door announced his entrance, and her weathered face creased into a welcoming smile that carried genuine warmth. "Silas Jones, I heard you bought some animals last night from a stranger. Does this mean you're planning to move on from Copper Ridge?" "Thinking about it seriously," Silas said, which was absolutely true, even if his reasons were considerably more complicated than she probably imagined. "Martha, you know anything specific about that train robbery from last year? The one down in Silver Falls with the stolen treasury notes?" Her expression grew more serious, the smile fading into something thoughtful and slightly concerned. "Everyone in the territory knows about it." "Why? Are you asking about it now?" "Just curious about some details. There was a federal marshal through here a few months back asking questions around town. You happen to remember his name?" "Garrett, I think it was. Thomas Garrett. He left word with several people that anyone with information about the robbery should contact his office in Denver." She studied Silas more carefully now, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You haven't gotten yourself mixed up in something dangerous, have you? Because you look troubled, Silas. More troubled than I've seen you in all the years I've known you. Just asking questions and trying to plan my next move," Silas assured her, keeping his voice casual. "Say, you wouldn't happen to know if there's a telegraph office between here and Red Creek? Somewhere I could send a message if I needed to." "There's one in Pine Bluff, about 15 miles south of here on the main road." "But Silas, if you're in some kind of trouble, if you need help—" "I'm fine, Martha, I promise. Just planning my route and thinking through my options, that's all." He bought a few basic supplies with credit she was willing to extend based on their long acquaintance. Some coffee, hardtack, dried meat, ammunition for his rifle and revolver. Martha recorded the debt in her ledger, with a troubled expression that suggested she didn't entirely believe his reassurances, but she didn't press him further. That was one of the things Silas had always appreciated about her. She understood that some men needed to work through their problems in their own way and their own time. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher in a cloudless sky, and Silas could feel the weight of time pressing down on him like a physical force. The bandits were out there somewhere, asking questions, and eventually someone in town would remember seeing a nervous stranger sell 3 hooded donkeys to Slick Jones. When that happened, Silas needed to either be gone or protected by something considerably stronger than his own wits and his old revolver. He led the donkeys toward the edge of town, thinking through the specifics of his developing plan. Pine Bluff was 15 miles south, roughly half a day's travel with loaded pack animals moving at a sustainable pace. If he could get there, send a telegraph to Marshal Garrett, explaining the situation in careful terms that wouldn't reveal too much over an open wire, and arrange some kind of protection or meeting, he might actually survive this situation. The difficult part would be convincing a federal marshal that a broke ranch hand had accidentally stumbled across the biggest robbery of the decade without somehow being involved in the crime himself. That part was definitely going to require some careful talking and probably a fair amount of luck. But Silas had spent 53 years learning how to talk to people, how to read situations, and find the angle that would work in his favor. He wasn't educated in any formal sense. He'd never spent much time in schools, and his reading skills were adequate, but not exceptional. But he knew people in the way that came from decades of close observation, knew how desperation looked and sounded, knew how to present himself as honest and straightforward, even when he was holding back important information. Marshal Garrett would be desperate to recover that stolen money and solve a case that had probably been causing him significant professional embarrassment for the past 6 months. Desperate enough, Silas hoped, to listen to an unlikely story if it came with solid proof and the promise of closing his most important open investigation. And Silas had proof. $50,000 worth of it, carefully hidden among the gear on 3 ordinary donkeys that nobody would look at twice if they passed them on the road. He just had to stay alive long enough to deliver it, and avoid getting caught by the bandits, and convince the marshal he was legitimate, and collect whatever reward might be offered. When he laid it out like that in his mind, the whole plan seemed absurdly optimistic, full of points where everything could go catastrophically wrong. But it was still better than any of his other options, which mostly involved running until he was caught, or hiding until he starved. The road south stretched out before him, dusty and uncertain under the morning sun. Somewhere behind him, 2 killers were searching for answers and running out of patience. Somewhere ahead, perhaps in Pine Bluff or Denver, or wherever Marshal Garrett happened to be, a federal lawman was waiting for the breakthrough that would solve his case and recover the government's money. And caught directly in the middle of all of it was Silas Jones, a man who'd spent his entire adult life working for other people's fortunes and following other people's orders, now carrying a fortune of his own and discovering that being rich, even temporarily, was vastly more complicated and dangerous than being poor had ever been. The donkeys plodded along beside him with their characteristic patience, their small hooves raising small puffs of dust with each step. They had no idea they were carrying a fortune, no sense of the danger that followed them like a shadow. They were just animals doing what animals did, following where they were led, and trusting that the human holding their lead ropes knew where he was going and had their best interests at heart. Silas wished he had even a fraction of their certainty and faith. All he had was a desperate plan, a slim hope that luck might finally decide to favor him after a lifetime of indifference, and the stubborn determination that had kept him going through 3 decades of hard work and harder disappointments. It would have to be enough, because the alternative, giving up, surrendering the money to the bandits, or getting killed in the attempt to keep it, was simply unacceptable. Silas had come too far and risked too much to quit now, even if the smart money said he didn't have a chance of succeeding. He'd never been particularly good at listening to the smart money anyway. The road to Pine Bluff cut through open country, characterized by scrub brush, weathered rock formations, and the kind of endless rolling hills that made distances deceptive. What looked like it might be an hour's travel often turned into 2 or 3, once you factored in the actual terrain and the limitations of pack animals. Silas kept the donkeys moving at a steady, sustainable pace, not too fast to draw attention from anyone who might be watching, not too slow to suggest hesitation or uncertainty. To any casual observer, he looked exactly like what he was pretending to be. Just another drifter heading south, maybe chasing rumors of work or opportunities in the next town over, making the kind of hopeful journey that thousands of men made every year in this territory. But Silas was acutely aware of his surroundings in ways he'd never experienced before in his decades of traveling these roads. Every distant rider made his pulse quicken and his hand drift unconsciously toward his revolver. Every rocky outcrop might conceal someone watching the road and taking note of who passed by. Every sound that didn't have an immediate and obvious explanation demanded his attention. The weight of the hidden currency pressed on his mind constantly, even though it added almost nothing to the physical load the donkeys carried. It was the knowledge of what he possessed, the understanding of how many people would kill him for it, that made every mile feel longer and more dangerous than it actually was. About 3 miles outside of Copper Ridge, the road dipped down into a shallow valley where a creek ran year-round, fed by springs higher in the hills. It was a natural stopping point for travelers, a place where both people and animals could drink and rest before continuing their journeys. Silas called a halt there, letting the donkeys drink their fill from the clear running water while he refilled his canteen and took a few minutes to scan the ridgeline above for any signs of pursuit or observation. Nothing visible, just the wind moving through the tall grass, carrying the scents of sage and wildflowers. A red-tailed hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermal currents and searching for prey with eyes far sharper than any human's. The morning was peaceful and beautiful in the way that country mornings often were, giving no hint of the danger and complications that had turned Silas's life upside down. He was about to call the donkeys away from the water and continue south when he heard hoofbeats approaching from that direction. A single rider, coming up the road at an easy canter that suggested neither urgency nor hesitation. Silas tensed immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon, but he forced himself to relax and appear casual. Running or acting suspicious would only make things worse, would mark him as someone with something to hide. The rider came into view around a bend where the creek curved through a stand of cottonwood trees. A woman, probably in her early 40s, sitting her horse with the casual competence that came from a lifetime spent in the saddle. She wore practical riding clothes, canvas pants, a work shirt, sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face from the sun. As she drew closer, Silas recognized her as Sarah Colton, who ran a small horse ranch about 10 miles south of Copper Ridge. He'd worked for her briefly several years back, helping break some young horses to saddle, and she'd always struck him as sharp, fair-minded, and not someone who missed much of what happened in her territory. "Morning, Silas," she called out, pulling her horse to a stop near the creek bank where the donkeys were still drinking. "Sarah," he nodded, keeping his voice neutral and friendly. "You're out early this morning. Had to pick up some supplies in town that came in on yesterday's freight wagon. Saw you heading out this direction and thought I'd say hello." She studied his pack animals with an appraising eye that suggested genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. "Nice donkeys. Where'd you find them? I didn't know you were in the market for pack animals." There was something in her tone that put Silas on immediate alert, not openly suspicious, but definitely curious in a way that went beyond simple small talk or neighborly interest. Sarah Colton was known throughout the region as a shrewd businesswoman who paid attention to details and didn't miss much of what happened around her property or along the roads she traveled regularly. "Bought them off a fellow passing through town last night," Silas said, maintaining the same story he'd told Jack and his partner earlier. "He was looking to sell quick, and I needed pack animals for some work I'm planning up in the high country. The price was right, so we made a deal. Heading up into the mountains then, maybe. Haven't entirely decided yet. Depends on what opportunities present themselves." Sarah dismounted with easy grace and let her horse drink alongside the donkeys. She pulled out a canteen from her saddlebag and took a long swallow, her eyes never leaving Silas's face during the entire process. "Funny thing happened early this morning, just after dawn. 2 men came by my place, asking if I'd seen anyone traveling with 3 donkeys. They said they were looking for stolen animals, claimed someone had taken them without permission." Silas's blood went cold despite the warming morning sun, but he kept his expression neutral and mildly curious. "That's so. What did you tell them?" "Told them I hadn't seen anything matching that description." She paused, studying him carefully, which was technically true at the time, since you hadn't passed by my ranch yet. They seemed pretty serious about finding these animals, even offered me $50 if I could tell them where to look. $50 is serious money for information, Silas observed carefully. "It is indeed." Sarah smiled, but there was no humor in the expression, just a kind of knowing awareness that made Silas distinctly uncomfortable. Made me curious about what was really going on, so I asked around a bit before I left town. Found out that these 2 men, one tall and thin, one shorter with a scar on his face, have been asking questions all over Copper Ridge about someone who bought donkeys last night. "And why would you turn down $50 and then come tell me about it?" Silas asked directly, deciding that honesty might serve him better than continued evasion with someone as perceptive as Sarah clearly was. "Because I recognized one of them," Sarah said flatly. "Jack Mercer. He used to run with a gang up in Colorado about 5 years back, before things got too hot for him there, and he had to relocate. Last I heard, through the informal network of people who pay attention to such things, he was suspected of involvement in that big train robbery down in Silver Falls last spring." Silas said nothing, just let her continue while he tried to figure out where this conversation was heading and whether Sarah represented a threat or possibly, improbably, some kind of opportunity. "So when Jack Mercer shows up in my territory offering serious money for information about stolen donkeys," Sarah continued, "I figure whatever's actually going on isn't exactly legal on his end of things. And since you've always struck me as an honest man in the years I've known you, Silas Jones, I'm guessing you've stumbled into something considerably more complicated than just buying some pack animals at a good price." It was a moment of critical decision. Silas could continue lying, try to maintain his story about being an innocent buyer who knew nothing about larger events. But Sarah Colton was clearly too smart and too well informed to buy that story, and she'd already demonstrated a willingness to help him by not telling Mercer where to look. That suggested she might be an ally rather than an enemy, though trusting anyone with this kind of secret carried enormous risks. On the other hand, traveling alone with $50,000 in stolen money and dangerous men actively hunting for him wasn't exactly a low-risk situation either. Maybe having someone else aware of the truth, someone who might be able to help, or at least provide information, was worth the gamble. "You ever heard the old saying about being in the wrong place at the right time?" Silas asked carefully. "I've heard it, yes. Well, I seem to have been in the right place at the wrong time. Bought 3 donkeys for $1 from a very nervous fellow who desperately wanted to leave town in a hurry. Turned out there was considerably more to those animals than anyone bargained for, including the fellow who sold them to me. The train robbery money," Sarah said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Silas nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth without putting it into words that could be repeated or used against him later. Sarah let out a long breath and looked out across the creek toward the southern hills. "That's one hell of a situation you've found yourself in, Silas." "It is," he agreed quietly. "What are you planning to do about it?" "I'm planning to head down to Pine Bluff and send a telegraph to the federal marshal in Denver, who's been investigating the robbery, turn over the money, claim whatever reward might be offered, and hope that gets me out of this mess with my skin intact, and maybe a few dollars to show for my trouble." "Jack Mercer's not going to let you just ride away with that money," Sarah said seriously. "He's killed people for a lot less, and that's a fact that can be verified if you know who to ask. And his partner, fellow named Dalton, he's worse, if the stories are even half true." "I know. That's why I need to reach the marshal as quickly as possible and get federal protection before they figure out I actually have what they're looking for." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the situation and its implications. Then she made a decision that Silas could see forming in her expression before she spoke. "My ranch is about 2 miles off the main road, down through that pass to the west." She gestured toward a gap in the hills that Silas had noticed, but never explored. "If you cut through there, instead of staying on this main road, you'll come out on a southern trail that runs roughly parallel to this one. It's not as well maintained, and the going is definitely rougher, but it'll keep you completely out of sight of anyone watching the main route for travelers." "Why would you help me like this?" Silas asked, genuinely curious and also cautious about accepting assistance that might come with strings attached or hidden costs. "Several reasons," Sarah said. "First, because Jack Mercer killed a friend of mine 3 years ago in a claim dispute up in Colorado Territory. Never proved it in court. Couldn't make the evidence stick, but I know it was him as surely as I know the sun rises in the east. And second, Because you've always been a decent man in all the dealings I've had with you over the years, Silas Jones. Decent men are in short supply out here, and when one of them needs help, I believe in providing it when I can. She swung back into her saddle with easy grace. There's a key hidden under the water barrel on the east side of the building if you need shelter or want to lay low for a few hours. The trail continues south from there and eventually connects with the main road about 2 miles north of Pine Bluff. I appreciate this more than I can say, Sarah. Don't appreciate it yet. Just get yourself to that marshal and let the law sort this whole mess out properly. And Silas, be careful out there. Mercer's as mean and dangerous as they come, and Dalton is somehow even worse. They won't stop looking just because you took a different road. They'll keep searching until they either find their money or confirm beyond any doubt that it's gone forever. She rode off the way she'd come, back toward Copper Ridge, moving at that same easy canter that suggested a woman who knew exactly where she was going and had no doubts about her decisions. Silas watched her disappear around the bend in the creek, then immediately turned his donkeys west toward the pass she'd indicated. The terrain was definitely rougher once he left the main road, just as Sarah had warned. The trail, if it could even be called that, wound through rocky ground studded with larger boulders and thick stands of brush that caught at clothing and pack straps. The donkeys handled the uneven ground remarkably well, their small hooves finding purchase where a larger horse might have struggled or refused to proceed. The passage took longer than traveling on the established road would have, but Silas felt marginally safer being off the main route where watchers might be posted. Around him, the land was quiet, except for the wind and the occasional call of a bird. The sun climbed higher as morning advanced toward noon, and the temperature rose accordingly. Silas rationed his water carefully, knowing that the next reliable source might be hours away, depending on how accurate Sarah's directions proved to be. He'd been traveling through the rough country for perhaps an hour when he heard it in the distance. The sound of multiple horses moving fast, their hoofbeats carrying clearly through the still air. They were on the main road, probably a quarter mile or more to the east, but sound traveled well in open country. Silas urged the donkeys into the shelter of an overhanging rock formation and waited, listening intently. The riders passed by without slowing, heading south at what sounded like a hard gallop. Silas counted at least 4 horses in the group, maybe as many as 6. That was more than just Mercer and Dalton, which meant they'd already called in reinforcements and were taking the search seriously enough to commit additional manpower to it. The fact that they were riding south suggested they'd either gotten information about his direction of travel or were simply covering the most obvious escape route. Either way, it confirmed that staying off the main road had been the right decision. If he'd continued south on the established route as originally planned, he'd have run straight into that search party. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely, Silas continued on through the rough terrain. The parallel trail Sarah had mentioned appeared exactly where she'd said it would, winding through a series of low hills that provided natural cover and concealment. The going was slower than on the main road, and the donkeys had to pick their way carefully over loose rock and around obstacles, but Silas felt the knot of tension in his chest ease slightly with every mile he put between himself and the searchers. The line shack appeared in the early afternoon, a small, weathered structure of rough-cut timber tucked into a hollow between 2 hills where it would be invisible from any distance. Silas approached cautiously, but the place was clearly empty and had been for some time. He found the key under the water barrel exactly where Sarah had said it would be and let himself inside. The interior was sparse and utilitarian, a single room containing a narrow bunk, a small cast-iron stove, and a few basic supplies left behind by whoever had last used the place, but it represented shelter and a chance to rest both himself and the animals before the final push to Pine Bluff. Silas decided to stay here for a few hours, let the donkeys graze on the sparse grass growing around the shack, and wait for the worst heat of the afternoon to pass before continuing his journey. He unloaded the pack animals and carefully checked all the places where he'd hidden the currency, making sure nothing had shifted or torn during the rough travel through the hills. Everything remained secure. $50,000 in stolen treasury notes, right there in front of him, and he still couldn't spend a single cent of it without risking his life. Silas sat in the doorway of the line shack, watching the donkeys graze peacefully in the afternoon sun, and let his mind wander through the various possibilities that lay ahead. If everything went according to his hastily assembled plan, he'd reach Pine Bluff by evening, send a telegram to Marshal Garrett first thing tomorrow morning, and arrange either a meeting or some kind of protective custody while the situation was sorted out. The reward money, even a fraction of the posted $10,000, would be enough to buy a small piece of land and start a modest ranching operation of his own. Not the fortune represented by the stolen currency, but honest money earned by doing the right thing, and that mattered to Silas in ways that were difficult to articulate, but absolutely fundamental to who he was as a person. The dream was appealing, but it felt fragile and contingent, dependent on so many things going right when his experience suggested that things usually went wrong in ways you couldn't anticipate. Still, it was a better dream than he'd had yesterday morning, when his biggest concern had been finding his next job and stretching his single dollar as far as possible. He must have dozed off at some point, because he woke with a sudden start to the sound of voices in the distance. Men's voices, multiple speakers, coming from the direction of the trail he'd followed to reach this place. Silas was on his feet instantly, his heart hammering in his chest and his hand reaching for his revolver. He moved quickly to the side window and peered out carefully, trying to assess the situation without exposing himself to observation. 3 riders had stopped on the trail about 100 yards from the shack. They weren't Mercer and Dalton, he could see that immediately, but they had the same hard, dangerous look about them. Men who lived by violence and intimidation, who carried guns like they were natural extensions of their bodies. They were studying the ground carefully, and Silas realized with sinking certainty that they were reading his trail, following the tracks left by 3 donkeys and 1 man leading them. One of the riders pointed directly toward the line shack and said something Silas couldn't make out at this distance. The 3 men dismounted and started walking toward the building, their hands resting on their gun belts, in a posture that was simultaneously casual and ready for violence. Silas cursed under his breath. He'd been careless, too focused on rest and recovery to think properly about covering his trail or concealing the evidence of his passage. Now he was potentially trapped in a small wooden building with 3 armed men approaching and nowhere to run that wouldn't expose him to gunfire in open ground. He quickly assessed his limited options with the cold clarity that comes from desperate circumstances. He had his Colt revolver with 6 rounds loaded, plus a Winchester rifle leaning against the wall with maybe a dozen more cartridges in the magazine. The donkeys were outside, vulnerable and exposed. Fighting 3 men was essentially suicide. Even if he managed to hit 1 or 2, the survivors would kill him, and then they'd have both him and the money. Running was equally impossible. The donkeys couldn't possibly outrun horses in this terrain, and abandoning them meant abandoning the hidden currency. That left talking as his only real option, which meant stepping outside before they reached the door and trying to convince them he was just an innocent traveler who'd stopped to rest. He holstered his revolver where it would be visible, but not immediately threatening, took a deep breath to steady himself, and stepped out of the shack before the approaching men reached the door. His hands were visible and empty, his posture non-threatening but not submissive, projecting the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and no reason to fear honest conversation. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he called out in a friendly tone. "Something I can help you with?" The lead man was older than the other 2, probably in his 50s, with a grey beard shot through with white and eyes that had seen too much of the world's ugliness to maintain any illusions about human nature. He stopped about 20 feet from Silas and studied him with careful attention. "You're Silas Jones," he said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement of established fact. Silas nodded, seeing no point in denying the obvious. "I am. We're here about those donkeys you bought in Copper Ridge yesterday evening, the ones that used to wear canvas hoods. Seems like everyone in the territory is suddenly interested in those particular animals," Silas observed. "You're the second group today who's come asking about them. The men you talked to this morning, Jack Mercer and Carl Dalton, they work for my employer. I'm here to make you a better offer than they did." "What kind of offer?" "The kind where you hand over what you found hidden in those hoods, and in exchange we let you walk away from this situation with your life intact and $5,000 in your pocket. That's considerably more money than you'd see in 10 years of ranch work, and all you have to do is give us what's rightfully ours in the first place." "And if I say I don't have what you're looking for?" The grey-bearded man smiled, but there was no warmth or humor in the expression, just the cold calculation of someone stating obvious facts. "Then we tear apart every piece of your gear until we find it, and you don't get the $5,000 or the continued breathing. Your choice, Mr. Jones, but I'd strongly recommend taking the smart option here." Silas considered the offer carefully. $5,000 was real, substantial money, enough to buy land, stock it with animals, build a house, start the kind of life he'd always wanted. It was also probably the only offer he was going to get that came with even a remote chance of survival. These men weren't lawmen bound by rules and procedures, but they also weren't the mindless killers that Mercer and Dalton seemed to be based on what Sarah had told him. They were businessmen of a particularly ruthless sort, trying to recover their employer's investment with minimum fuss and complication. But accepting their offer meant giving up on the larger reward from the federal government, giving up on doing the right thing, giving up on the dream of earning money honestly, rather than through deals with criminals. And more than that, it meant spending the rest of his life knowing he'd chosen the easy path, the safe path, the path that required nothing of him except surrendering his principles when they became inconvenient. Silas had spent his entire adult life taking the smart option, playing it safe, accepting whatever deals other men offered him, because resistance seemed pointless and rebellion seemed futile. And where had all that caution and practicality gotten him? 53 years old, broke and used up, with nothing to show for decades of hard work, except a worn-out body and a few fading memories of better days. Maybe, just this once in his entire careful life, he'd take the stupid option, the one that might get him killed, but also might give him something worth having beyond simple survival. "I appreciate the offer," Silas said slowly, choosing his words with care, "but I think I'm going to have to pass on it." The grey-bearded man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. A subtle tightening of tension, a sense of possibilities narrowing down to a single inevitable outcome. "That's a disappointing decision, Mr. Jones. I imagine it is from your perspective. You understand what you're choosing here. These men with me, they're not going to be gentle about searching your belongings. They're going to go through everything you own, and if you give them any trouble during that process, they're going to make absolutely certain you regret it before you die. I understand what I'm choosing. Then you're either remarkably brave or remarkably stupid. Probably both," Silas admitted, with a slight smile that held no humor. "I've never been particularly good at knowing the difference." The grey-bearded man sighed deeply, sounding genuinely regretful. "All right, boys, do what needs doing. Be thorough." What happened next happened with brutal efficiency. The two younger men moved toward Silas with clear hostile intent, and while Silas had been in his share of fights over the years, and age hadn't completely robbed him of the reflexes that had kept him alive through rough times and rougher men, he was still one aging ranch hand against two younger, stronger opponents who'd clearly done this sort of thing many times before. As the first man reached for him, Silas pivoted sharply and drove his elbow into the man's face with all the force he could generate, feeling and hearing the satisfying crunch of a nose breaking. The man went down hard, blood streaming between his fingers as he clutched at his injured face. But the second man was faster and more experienced, getting an arm around Silas's throat from behind in a chokehold that immediately cut off his air supply. Silas drove his boot heel down on the man's instep and twisted hard, breaking the hold momentarily. His hand reached for his revolver, but the grey-bearded man already had his own gun drawn, the barrel pointed steadily at Silas's chest with the kind of practiced ease that comes from years of use. "That's quite enough of that," the older man said calmly, his voice carrying no anger or excitement, just cold professional assessment. Silas froze, his hand still reaching for his weapon, but not quite touching it. The two younger men recovered quickly, both of them bleeding now, one from his broken nose, the other from where Silas's elbow had caught his lip and split it open. They looked angry and eager to repay the violence, their eyes promising retribution. "I'm going to give you one more chance here," the grey-bearded man said, still holding his gun steady. "Tell us where you hid the money, take your $5,000, and walk away from this alive and relatively undamaged. If you make us search for it the hard way, there's no deal and no mercy afterward. This is your last opportunity to make a smart choice." Silas met the man's cold eyes and saw his own death, reflected there if he continued to resist. But he'd made his decision, and changing it now would mean that everything he'd risked so far had been for nothing. "I already gave you my answer." The grey-bearded man nodded slowly, and something like respect flickered briefly across his weathered features. "All right then, boys, tear it all apart. Search everything, and if Mr. Jones gives you any more trouble, feel free to return the favor he just gave you." The two men advanced on Silas again, and this time, when he fought back, it was brief and ultimately futile. They beat him methodically, not with rage or passion, but with the practiced efficiency of men who knew exactly how to inflict pain without causing death too quickly or permanent damage that would interfere with questioning. Silas went down hard under their assault, tasting blood in his mouth, feeling ribs crack on his left side, his vision swimming as a fist connected with his temple. Through the haze of pain and fading consciousness, he watched them begin tearing apart his carefully packed gear with systematic thoroughness, dumping out the feed bags, ripping open the blankets, pulling apart everything he'd assembled with such care that morning in Copper Ridge. It was only a matter of time before they found what they were looking for. The hiding places he'd created were clever enough to fool a casual inspection, but not thorough enough to survive the kind of determined search these men were conducting. And then, somewhere in the distance, Silas heard something that made absolutely no sense in his current situation. A train whistle, long, mournful, and getting progressively closer with each sounding. The grey-bearded man heard it too. He frowned deeply, looking toward the south where the sound was originating. "There's no rail line through this area," he said, puzzlement clear in his voice. But there was, Silas remembered through the fog of pain. Sarah Colton had mentioned it once during his time working on her ranch, an old spur line that ran from Pine Bluff to a played-out mining operation up in the hills. It wasn't used frequently anymore, maybe once or twice a week for supplies and mail service, and most people who weren't local had forgotten it even existed. The train whistle sounded again, much closer now, the sound carrying clearly through the afternoon air, and that's precisely when the shooting started in earnest. The distant crack of rifles echoed sharply across the hills, followed immediately by men's shouts and the panicked neighing of horses. The grey-bearded man and his two companions looked at each other in confusion and alarm, then turned back toward the trail where they'd left their horses tied. More gunfire erupted, closer now, the distinctive sounds of multiple weapons being discharged simultaneously, and then riders appeared on the trail, at least 6 of them, coming hard and fast with their guns already drawn and firing, But they weren't shooting at Silas or the grey-bearded man and his associates. They were shooting at each other. It took Silas a moment to understand, through the haze of pain, what was actually happening before his eyes. Two separate groups of men, both converging on the line shack at essentially the same time, both after the same thing he was carrying, and neither group willing to let the other reach it first. Jack Mercer and Carl Dalton's gang had somehow found the trail despite Silas's precautions, and whoever the grey-bearded man worked for had clearly sent reinforcements to ensure the recovery of their stolen money. Now both groups had arrived simultaneously, and the situation was rapidly deteriorating into open warfare. The line shack was about to become an active battlefield, and Silas was lying right in the middle of it with broken ribs and fading consciousness. The grey-bearded man barked urgent orders to his two companions. "Forget the gear. We're leaving immediately. Get to the horses now." But it was already far too late for an orderly retreat. The first wave of riders thundered into the small clearing around the shack, guns blazing in all directions. The grey-bearded man's horse went down first, screaming horribly as bullets tore through its body, and it collapsed in a twitching heap. One of the younger men took a round in the shoulder and spun away violently, clutching at the wound and cursing steadily. Blood spread rapidly across his shirt. Silas rolled desperately toward the line shack, using what little strength remained in his battered body to drag himself through the doorway and out of the immediate line of fire. Bullets splintered the wood around him, kicking up splinters and dust, punching holes through the weathered planks. Outside, he could hear men screaming in pain and rage, horses neighing in absolute terror. The constant hammering crack of gunfire, creating a continuous roar that made thinking nearly impossible. His donkeys. Through the doorway, Silas could see them, still tied near the shack where he'd left them to graze, now terrified by the noise and violence erupting around them. One of them had already been hit by a stray bullet, a dark stain spreading rapidly across its flank. The animal was struggling against its rope, trying desperately to flee. The other two were pulling frantically at their restraints, their eyes rolling white with fear. Silas forced himself to his feet, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain in his broken ribs that made every breath an agony. He'd come this far with these animals, had risked everything because of what they carried, and he absolutely was not going to let them die here because of his mistakes and his choices. He stumbled out the back of the shack, staying low and moving as quickly as his injured body would allow, and circled around to where the donkeys were tied. Bullets whined past him like angry hornets, close enough that he could hear their passage through the air. He reached the donkeys and pulled out his pocket-knife with shaking hands, cutting through the ropes that held them. "Go on!" he shouted over the chaos, slapping their flanks as hard as he could manage. "Get out of here! Run!" The two healthy donkeys bolted immediately, disappearing into the broken terrain behind the shack with the kind of speed that panicked animals could achieve when survival depended on it. The wounded one tried desperately to follow, but stumbled badly, its injured leg giving out beneath it. The animal went down hard, struggling to rise but unable to coordinate its movements properly. The gunfight raged on in front of the shack with undiminished intensity. Through gaps in the structure, Silas could see bodies now. At least 2 men down, and not moving, maybe more hidden by the smoke and confusion. The grey-bearded man was still fighting, despite losing his horse, using the animal's dead body for cover, while his revolver barked methodically. Somewhere in the chaos, he could hear Jack Mercer's voice rising above the general din, shouting orders to his men and cursing anyone who got in his way. Silas made a split-second decision, born of desperation and the kind of stubborn determination that had defined his entire life. He grabbed the wounded donkey's halter with both hands and pulled, dragging the struggling animal toward a narrow gap between 2 large rock formations, about 30 yards behind the shack. The donkey resisted, frightened and in pain, but Silas was stronger than his battered condition suggested, driven by adrenaline and the absolute refusal to give up when he'd already come so far. They made it to the rocks, just as someone threw a torch through the line shack's front window. Fire caught immediately in the dry, weathered wood, and within seconds the entire structure was engulfed in flames. The heat was instantly intense, driving the combatants back and creating a temporary lull in the violence as both sides retreated from the inferno. Thick black smoke billowed upward, providing cover and confusion. Silas and the wounded donkey huddled in the narrow space between the rocks, hidden from direct view by smoke and terrain. He could hear men calling to each other outside, trying to regroup and assess their casualties, attempting to figure out what to do next. The train whistle sounded again, extremely close now, and suddenly Silas understood what might be his only remaining chance at survival. The old spur line Sarah had mentioned ran through a cut in the hills about a quarter-mile south of the line shack. If he could somehow get there before the train passed through, if he could signal it to stop, he might be able to get out of this nightmare alive. It was a desperate plan built on multiple layers of uncertainty and luck, but it was literally all he had left. He waited until the smoke from the burning shack was at its absolute thickest, providing maximum cover and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Then he started moving south with painful slowness, half carrying and half dragging the injured donkey with him. Every step was agony. His broken ribs screamed in protest with each breath. His vision swam from the beating he'd taken, and the donkey's weight was almost more than his damaged body could manage. But he kept moving regardless, using every bit of cover the broken terrain offered, staying low and hoping desperately that the men behind him were too busy fighting each other to notice one old ranch hand escaping with a wounded pack animal. The train whistle blew again, very close now and getting closer with each passing second. Silas could see the rail cut ahead through the smoke and heat haze, could see the dark plume of locomotive smoke rising into the afternoon sky. He was going to make it. Against absolutely every reasonable expectation, he was actually going to reach the tracks before the train passed. And then he heard the voice directly behind him, close enough to make his blood run cold. "Going somewhere, old man?" Silas turned slowly to find Jack Mercer, standing perhaps 20 feet away, his gun already drawn and pointed steadily at Silas's chest. The tall man's face was streaked with soot and blood from the battle, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and frustrated desperation. His clothes were torn, and he had a fresh wound on his left arm that was bleeding freely, but his gun hand remained perfectly steady. "You've caused me considerably more trouble than any 10 men I've ever dealt with," Mercer said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Where's my money?" "Don't have it," Silas replied, which was technically accurate at that specific moment. The wounded donkey standing beside him carried some of the currency hidden in its modified feed bags and gear, but the majority was with the 2 healthy animals that had fled into the hills minutes earlier. "That's an obvious lie, and I'm tired of your lies." "Maybe it is, but you're going to have to shoot me to find out for certain, and that gunshot will bring every man from both sides running to this location. You ready for that kind of attention?" Mercer's finger visibly tightened on the trigger, and for a long moment Silas was absolutely certain he was about to die right there, shot down by a furious outlaw with nothing left to lose. Then the train whistle blew again, startlingly close now, and Mercer's eyes involuntarily flicked toward the sound for just a fraction of a second. It was all the opportunity Silas needed, or was likely to get. He shoved the wounded donkey directly toward Mercer, as hard as his remaining strength would allow, and threw himself sideways toward the cover of nearby rocks. Mercer fired, but the shot went wide as the panicked animal collided with him and threw off his aim. Silas scrambled to his feet and ran for the rail cut with every ounce of desperate energy his battered body could summon, his lungs burning and his broken ribs sending sharp spikes of agony through his chest with each gasping breath. Behind him, he could hear Mercer cursing viciously and running in pursuit. Another shot rang out, and Silas felt something tug hard at his shirt, but kept running without looking back. The train was almost at the cut now, its brakes already screaming, as the engineer began slowing for the grade. Silas burst out onto the tracks directly in front of the approaching locomotive, waving his arms frantically in the universal signal for emergency stop. The engineer saw him and yanked the emergency brake with obvious alarm. The train shrieked and sparked, metal grinding against metal with a sound like the end of the world, but physics and momentum weren't easily overcome. The massive locomotive kept coming, and Silas realized with absolute crystalline clarity that he'd badly misjudged the distance, that he was about to be crushed by the very thing he'd been trying to flag down for rescue. He dove to the side at the last possible instant, feeling the tremendous heat and wind of the train's passage, feeling the ground shake violently beneath him. He hit the rocky slope at the edge of the cut hard and tumbled, his body taking additional punishment it could barely afford, coming to rest finally in a painful heap at the bottom of the embankment. When his vision cleared and the ringing in his ears subsided enough to hear, he could see that the train had managed to stop about 50 yards past where he'd been standing. Men were already climbing down from the cars, shouting questions to each other in confusion and alarm. And running toward them from the direction of the burning line shack were Jack Mercer and at least 3 other men from his gang, their weapons drawn and their intentions clearly hostile. But these weren't ordinary travelers or freight handlers emerging from the train cars. As the passengers and crew descended, Silas saw with growing hope the gleam of federal badges, saw the coordinated and disciplined way they moved, saw the military-grade rifles they carried with obvious familiarity and competence. Federal marshals, at least a dozen of them, possibly more still inside the cars, and leading them, checking on Silas with what appeared to be genuine concern on his weathered, experienced face, was a man who perfectly matched the description Silas had heard multiple times. Marshal Thomas Garrett of the Denver District Office, the federal officer who'd been investigating the Silver Falls train robbery for the past 6 months. "You all right there, friend?" Garrett asked, offering his hand to help Silas to his feet. His grip was strong and steady, the kind of hand that had pulled men out of trouble before and knew how to do it properly. "Been considerably better," Silas admitted, accepting the assistance and trying not to show just how badly injured he actually was. "But I've got something you've been looking for, Marshal, or at least, I know where most of it is." Garrett's eyes sharpened immediately with intense professional interest. "The Silver Falls money?" "Yes, sir. Every dollar of it." Jack Mercer and his men had stopped running. They stood frozen about 100 yards away, suddenly and painfully aware that they were badly outnumbered and completely outgunned by federal law enforcement officers who had every legal right to shoot them on sight. Through the smoke from the still-burning line shack, Silas could see the grey-bearded man and his remaining associates emerging as well, also recognizing that the situation had changed dramatically, and not in their favor. Marshal Garrett raised his voice with the kind of projection and authority that came from years of command experience. "This is United States Marshal Thomas Garrett. All of you men, drop your weapons immediately and put your hands where I can see them. Anyone who tries to run will be shot without further warning. This is your only opportunity to surrender peacefully." For a tense moment that seemed to stretch out forever. It could have gone either way. The outlaws were cornered and desperate, which made them extremely dangerous. But they were also practical enough to recognize when they'd lost, when continuing to fight would accomplish nothing except getting them killed. The grey-bearded man was the first to drop his pistol and raise his hands in surrender. The others followed his lead with varying degrees of reluctance, even Jack Mercer, though the hatred burning in his eyes as he stared at Silas could have melted steel and bent iron. Garrett's deputies moved in with practiced efficiency to secure the prisoners, disarming them and binding their hands while reading out charges that would likely keep them in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. The marshal himself turned his full attention back to Silas, helping him sit down on a relatively flat rock and signaling for the medical personnel who'd apparently been traveling with the Marshals group. "You've had quite an eventful day, it seems," Garrett observed, with what might have been slight understatement. "That's one way of putting it," Silas agreed, trying not to wince too obviously, as a deputy with medical training began examining his injuries with gentle but thorough hands. "I bought 3 donkeys for $1 yesterday evening in Copper Ridge, Marshal. Turned out they were carrying considerably more than I bargained for when I made that purchase." "The stolen treasury notes?" "Yes, sir. They were sewn into thick canvas hoods that were supposed to keep the animals from going mad if they saw sunlight. The fellow who sold them to me didn't know the money was actually there. He'd apparently stolen the donkeys from the real thieves and gotten himself thoroughly spooked by his own invented curse story. Sold them to me cheap just to be rid of them and get out of town fast." Garrett listened with careful attention as Silas laid out the entire story in as much detail as his exhausted mind could manage, occasionally asking clarifying questions to fill in gaps or confirm specific details. The Marshal's weathered face remained professionally neutral throughout the recitation, but Silas could see the wheels turning behind those experienced eyes, assessing the story for truthfulness and internal consistency. When Silas finished his account, the Marshal nodded slowly, with what looked like satisfaction. "And you were heading to Pine Bluff to contact my office and turn over the recovered currency?" "That was my plan, yes, sir. It didn't work out quite the way I'd hoped, but the intention was always to get this money back to the proper authorities and let the law handle things from there. That shows considerably better judgment than most men would exercise in similar circumstances." Garrett looked toward the burning line shack, then back at Silas with a slight smile. "You're a remarkably lucky man, Mr. Jones. We've been tracking the gang responsible for the Silver Falls robbery for 6 months now, with limited success. We knew they were operating somewhere in this general territory. Knew they'd stashed the money rather than trying to spend it immediately, but we couldn't pin down their exact location or identify all the members. When we received word this morning about a developing shootout near Pine Bluff involving multiple groups, we commandeered this supply train and rode straight here, hoping to catch them in the act. So all this chaos, the different gangs fighting over the money, the burning shack, everything, that's what brought you here at exactly the right moment. Sometimes Providence works in genuinely mysterious ways," Garrett said with genuine warmth. "Now, about those donkeys you mentioned. 2 of them ran off, you said, into the hills behind the line shack when the fighting started. The wounded one might still be back there near those rocks if it hasn't wandered off or died from its injuries." All 3 were carrying hidden currency distributed throughout their gear and equipment. Garrett immediately dispatched several of his deputies to search for the animals, giving them detailed descriptions and emphasizing the importance of recovering them undamaged. While they conducted their search, the medical deputy finished his examination of Silas's injuries and delivered his assessment. 3 cracked ribs on the left side, extensive bruising across the torso and face, possible mild concussion, various cuts and abrasions. Nothing immediately life-threatening if treated properly, but you're going to be extremely sore for several weeks at minimum. I'd strongly recommend complete rest and limited physical activity. "I'll rest when this is all finished," Silas said, though the prospect of lying down somewhere safe and not moving for about a week sounded increasingly appealing with each passing minute. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the deputies returned with all 3 donkeys. Baume's wounded one would recover with proper veterinary care, and a quick examination of the gear revealed exactly what Silas had described. Thousands of dollars in uncut treasury notes, carefully hidden in modified feed bags, blankets with false seams, tool handles with hollow cores, and various other clever concealment methods. "This is perhaps 2/3 of what was originally stolen," Garrett said, after conducting a quick preliminary count. "The rest must have been in those canvas hoods you mentioned disposing of. Jack Mercer and his partner Carl Dalton took them after they searched my shed this morning," Silas explained. Figured out the hoods had contained currency and assumed I'd taken it. They must have the remaining notes with them now. A thorough search of the prisoners quickly confirmed this suspicion. Mercer and Dalton had been carrying several $1,000s in notes divided between their saddlebags, and the grey-bearded man, who identified himself under questioning as Clayton Morris, working for a crime syndicate based in Colorado, had the rest of the missing currency hidden in various locations throughout his gear and that of his associates. By the time full darkness had fallen and the deputies had lit lanterns to continue their work, Marshal Garrett had recovered the entire stolen fortune from the Silver Falls train robbery, every last dollar of the original $50,000 taken 6 months earlier. He sat down on the train steps next to Silas as his men finished securing the prisoners and cataloguing the evidence. Both men watching the organized chaos with the weary satisfaction of a difficult job completed. "Mr. Jones, I want you to understand something important," Garrett said seriously. "What you did over the past day and a half, keeping that money safe despite multiple threats to your life, trying to contact the proper authorities instead of just keeping it for yourself or running away with it, that demonstrates real character and integrity. In my considerable experience working in law enforcement, most men in your situation would have simply disappeared with the money and hoped for the best. The fact that you didn't says something significant about who you are as a person." "I thought about running," Silas admitted honestly. "Thought about it seriously. But it didn't seem right, keeping stolen money even if nobody knew I had it. And besides, those were dangerous men chasing me. Didn't seem likely I'd get very far before they caught up. Practical and honest. That's a valuable combination." Garrett pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger from his coat pocket and began writing with a pencil stub. "The posted reward for recovery of the stolen currency is $10,000 for information leading to recovery. But that's just for information. The actual physical recovery of the money, plus your role in the capture of both Jack Mercer's gang and Clayton Morris's organization, that's worth considerably more. I'm authorized under federal regulations to offer you $15,000, Mr. Jones, and I'm going to personally recommend to the Treasury Department that they pay you the full amount without any bureaucratic delays." $15,000. The number was so large it almost didn't register properly in Silas's exhausted mind. It was more money than he could have earned in a lifetime of hard ranch work. It was enough to buy good land, build a proper house, stock a ranch with quality cattle and horses, and still have money left over for lean years and unexpected problems. It represented everything he'd ever wanted: security, independence, a future that didn't depend on the whims of other men or the failures of an aging body. "I appreciate that more than I can properly express, Marshal. You've earned it honestly, which is more than most people can say about large sums of money." Garrett closed his ledger. "There will be some necessary paperwork to handle in Denver, testimony to give at the trials of Mercer and Morris and their associates, that sort of bureaucratic necessity. But once that's properly completed, the reward money is yours, free and clear. What will you do with it?" Silas looked out across the darkening landscape toward the distant mountains, thinking about all the years he'd spent working for other men's profits, all the dreams he'd carefully set aside because they seemed impossible or impractical. "I think I'll buy myself a piece of land, somewhere up in the high country, where the grass grows thick and the water runs clean year-round. Start a small ranch operation of my own. Maybe run some cattle, raise a few good horses, work for myself instead of for someone else's benefit." "That sounds like an excellent plan," Garrett said with genuine approval. "The kind of plan a man can build a good life around." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching as the deputies finished securing the prisoners and loading the recovered currency onto the train for transport back to Denver. The wounded donkey was being tended by someone with veterinary experience, and the other two stood calmly nearby, completely oblivious to their brief but significant role in one of the territory's most dramatic criminal investigations. Somewhere in the darkness, The line shack continued burning itself out, collapsing gradually into glowing embers and ash. The bodies of the men who died in the shootout had been respectfully covered and would be transported to Pine Bluff for proper burial and identification. The whole chaotic, violent, desperate situation that had dominated Silas's life for the past day and a half was finally, genuinely over. Marshal Garrett stood and stretched, his joints popping audibly. "We should get you on this train and back to civilization, where a proper doctor can look at those injuries. You'll ride with us to Denver. Give your initial statement while everything is still fresh in your memory, and we'll get the administrative processes started. With any luck, you'll have your reward money within a few weeks at most." Silas allowed himself to be helped aboard the train, his body protesting every movement, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. The seats were hard, and the ride would undoubtedly be uncomfortable with his cracked ribs, but none of that mattered compared to the simple fact that he'd survived. He'd done the right thing, despite multiple opportunities to do otherwise. And he was finally, genuinely going to have the chance to build the life he'd always wanted. As the train pulled away from the scene of chaos and violence, heading south toward Pine Bluff and then on to Denver, Silas leaned his head back against the seat and allowed his eyes to close. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, paperwork and testimony, and all the complications of dealing with federal bureaucracy. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas Jones felt something that had been absent from his life for far too long. Hope, real, genuine, justified hope for a better future, built on honest choices and earned rewards rather than on luck or the charity of others. It was a good feeling, one he intended to hold on to tightly as he began the next chapter of his life. The train rolled on through the darkness, carrying Silas toward a future that finally looked bright with genuine possibility. 3 months had passed since that violent afternoon near Pine Bluff, when Silas Jones's life had changed forever. 3 months of testimony at federal trials, of depositions and paperwork, and endless bureaucratic procedures. 3 months of watching Jack Mercer and Clayton Morris and their various associates be sentenced to long terms in federal prison for their roles in the Silver Falls train robbery and the subsequent violence. 3 months of patient waiting while the Treasury Department processed his reward claim and verified every detail of his story multiple times. But the wait had been worth it. Marshal Garrett had been as good as his word. The full $15,000 had been deposited in Silas's name at a bank in Denver, with no deductions, no unexpected complications, no bureaucratic obstacles, just honest money, honestly earned, sitting there ready to be used for building the future Silas had spent decades dreaming about. He'd used the first portion of the money wisely, taking his time to heal properly from his injuries before making any major decisions. The cracked ribs had mended cleanly over several weeks of rest, the bruises had faded, and the cuts had healed into scars that would serve as permanent reminders of the most eventful days of his life. He'd stayed in a modest boarding house in Denver during his recovery, using the time to research land prices, talk to other ranchers about good locations, and make careful plans. When he was finally ready to move forward, Silas had taken his time finding exactly the right piece of property. He'd looked at more than a dozen potential ranches before settling on a parcel of land about 60 miles northwest of Denver, up in the high country, where the air was clean and cool even in summer. 200 acres of good grazing land with a year-round creek running through it, surrounded by national forest land that provided natural boundaries and protection. The previous owner had been an older rancher ready to retire, and the property came with a small but solid house, a barn in decent repair, and several outbuildings that would serve Silas's purposes perfectly. The purchase had taken $8,000, leaving him with $7,000 for livestock, equipment, and operating expenses. It was enough, more than enough, actually, to start the kind of modest but sustainable operation he'd always envisioned. Now, on a clear morning in late autumn, with the aspen trees turning gold in the hills and the first hints of winter visible on the highest peaks, Silas stood on his own front porch looking out across his own land, his ranch, his future, built with his own money, earned through his own choices. The transformation of the property over the past month had been remarkable. He'd purchased 20 head of good breeding cattle from a rancher, selling off part of his herd, along with a fine young bull that would serve for several years. He'd bought 3 horses. Nothing fancy, but solid, reliable, working animals that knew their business, and he'd acquired several additional donkeys, partly for practical purposes, but mostly because he felt a certain sentimental attachment to the animals that had inadvertently changed his life. The original 3 donkeys from that fateful purchase lived here now as well, recovered and healthy. The wounded one had healed completely under proper veterinary care, showing no lasting effects from the bullet that had nearly ended its life. All 3 grazed peacefully in the morning sun, completely unaware of their role in one of the territory's most dramatic crime stories. Silas had hired 2 young ranch hands to help with the heavier work, brothers from a farming family who needed employment and were willing to learn the cattle business. They lived in one of the outbuildings he'd converted into basic but comfortable quarters, and they worked hard without complaint. Having employees felt strange to Silas after spending his entire adult life being someone else's employee, but he treated them the way he'd always wished to be treated, fairly, respectfully, with honest wages paid on time and appreciation shown for good work. The sound of a horse approaching drew his attention. Sarah Colton rode into view, sitting her saddle with the same easy competence he remembered. She'd made the trip from her own ranch several times since he'd moved here, bringing advice about local conditions and helping him establish connections with other ranchers in the area. She'd become a good friend during his recovery and the establishment of his new life, and Silas valued her practical wisdom and straightforward manner. "Morning, Silas," she called out as she dismounted. "Thought I'd ride over and see how you're settling in." "Morning, Sarah. Come on up. I've got fresh coffee if you're interested." They sat on the porch together, drinking coffee and watching the cattle graze in the distance. The morning was peaceful in the way that mountain mornings often were, with just the sounds of animals and wind, and the distant call of birds. It was the kind of peace that Silas had dreamed about during all those years of working for other men, the kind of contentment that comes from building something with your own hands on your own land. "You've done well with this place," Sarah observed. "Most men with your kind of windfall would have spent it foolishly or lost it to bad decisions. You've been smart and careful." "I had a lot of time to think about what I wanted while I was waiting for the bureaucracy to finish its work," Silas said. "Decided that simple and sustainable was better than complicated and impressive. This ranch won't make me rich, but it'll provide a good living if I work it properly. That's all I ever really wanted." "That's wisdom, Silas. Real wisdom. More people should think that way." They talked for a while longer about ranching matters, about neighbors and weather predictions, and the 100 small details that made up daily life in the high country. Sarah eventually took her leave, riding back toward her own property, with a promise to return soon. Silas watched her go, then turned his attention back to his own land and his own work. There was fence that needed mending in the south pasture, hay to be brought in and stored before the winter snows came, 100 tasks both large and small that required attention, but they were his tasks, his responsibilities, his choices about how to spend his time and energy. As he walked toward the barn to collect his tools, Silas passed the 3 donkeys that had started this whole improbable journey. They looked up at his approach, their large, gentle eyes watching him with calm curiosity. He stopped and ran his hand along the nearest one's neck, feeling the warmth of its coat and the solid reality of its presence. "Well, friends," he said quietly, "we've come a long way together, haven't we? From a $1 purchase in a saloon to all of this. Not bad for a broke ranch hand, and 3 supposedly cursed animals." The donkeys, naturally, had no response beyond continuing to watch him with patient interest, before going back to their grazing. But that was fine. Silas didn't need a response. He just needed them to be here, healthy and safe, reminding him of how quickly life could change if you made the right choices when opportunities presented themselves. He collected his tools and headed out to work on that fence, moving at the steady, sustainable pace of a man who had time enough to do things properly. The sun climbed higher, warming the autumn air, and the mountains stood eternal and unchanging in the distance. Silas Jones had spent 53 years working toward this moment, this place, this peace, this sense of purpose and belonging. It had taken 3 donkeys, $50,000 in stolen money, several dangerous criminals, 1 lucky train arrival, and a federal marshal to get here. But he'd arrived, finally and genuinely, at exactly where he was supposed to be. The fence work took most of the morning, but Silas didn't mind. There was satisfaction in physical labor when you were working for yourself, when every nail driven and every post set was improving your own property rather than someone else's. His ribs still ached occasionally when he moved wrong, a reminder of that violent day, but the pain was manageable and fading with time. By noon, he'd finished mending the damaged section and was walking back toward the house when he noticed a rider approaching from the direction of the main road. As the figure drew closer, Silas recognized the distinctive uniform and badge of a federal marshal. For a moment, his heart rate increased, and old instincts kicked in. Had something gone wrong with the trials? Were there more questions to answer? Had some legal complication emerged to threaten everything he'd built? But as the rider came into clearer view, Silas relaxed. It was Marshal Garrett himself, and the older man's expression was friendly rather than official. "Marshal," Silas greeted him as Garrett dismounted. "This is an unexpected visit. I hope there's no trouble." "No trouble at all," Garrett assured him warmly. "I was passing through this area on other business, and thought I'd stop by to see how you're managing with your new ranch. Professional curiosity, you might say, about how my cases turn out in the long run. I appreciate the visit. Come inside. I'll put on fresh coffee." They settled in the modest but comfortable main room of the house, and Silas told the marshal about his progress over the past months, the livestock purchases, the improvements to the property, his plans for the coming years. Garrett listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood ranching better than Silas might have expected from a federal lawman. "You've built something solid here," Garrett said finally. "Something that will last if you continue managing it the way you've started. I'm pleased to see the reward money being used so wisely." "It's honest money honestly earned," Silas said. "Felt right to use it for building an honest life." "Speaking of the case," Garrett continued, "I thought you might be interested in knowing how the legal proceedings concluded. Jack Mercer received 30 years in federal prison for his role in the train robbery and the subsequent violence. Clayton Morris got 25. Most of their associates received similar sentences, ranging from 10 to 20 years. The judge made it very clear that the federal government takes crimes involving stolen treasury funds extremely seriously. "That seems fair," Silas said. "Those men killed people during that robbery, and would have killed me without hesitation if circumstances had been different." "Indeed they would have. Your testimony was crucial in securing those convictions, Mr. Jones. The prosecution was very grateful for your clear and honest accounting of events." They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging across various topics, both related and unrelated to the case. Garrett told stories from his long career in law enforcement, and Silas shared memories from his decades of ranch work. It was the comfortable conversation of 2 men who'd shared unusual circumstances and developed mutual respect through that shared experience. When Garrett finally prepared to leave, he paused on the porch and looked out across Silas's land with an expression of genuine satisfaction. "You know, in my line of work, you see a lot of the worst aspects of human nature. Greed, violence, betrayal. It can make you cynical about people if you're not careful. But then I see something like this, a man who had every opportunity and temptation to make the wrong choice, who chose correctly instead, and who used the rewards of that choice to build something good and lasting. It restores my faith in human decency. "I just did what seemed right," Silas said simply. "That's exactly my point. When doing what's right means risking your life, most people look for easier options. You didn't. That matters, Mr. Jones. It matters more than you probably realize." Garrett mounted his horse and tipped his hat in farewell. "If you ever need anything, if any legal complications arise from the case, if someone gives you trouble about any of this, you contact my office immediately. You've earned the protection of the federal government, and I'll make sure you get it if circumstances require." "I appreciate that, Marshal, truly." Silas watched Garrett ride away until the marshal disappeared from view along the winding road. Then he turned back to his own land, his own home, his own future. The afternoon stretched ahead with more work to be done. There was always more work on a ranch. But he approached it with quiet contentment, rather than the resignation that had characterized so much of his previous working life. As the sun began its descent toward evening, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Silas stood once more on his porch and took stock of everything he could see. The cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the horses moving lazily in their paddock, the 3 donkeys that had inadvertently changed his life, now just ordinary animals living ordinary lives with no awareness of their extraordinary history. It was a good life, not the life he'd imagined in his youth, when dreams had been bigger and more grandiose, but it was real and solid, and his, built through choices and chances and a willingness to do the right thing, even when the easier path had been clearly marked. The cowboy who bought 3 donkeys for $1 and found a fortune. That's how the story would be told in saloons and around campfires for years to come, passed from person to person until the details became distorted and the truth became legend. Silas knew how these things worked. The story would grow in the telling, become more dramatic and less accurate with each repetition. But he also knew the real truth, the version that mattered to him. He'd bought 3 animals out of desperation and need, discovered something that belonged to someone else, and chosen to return it rather than keep it, despite enormous temptation and significant danger. That choice had led to reward and opportunity, which he'd used to build exactly the kind of life he'd always wanted. It was a simple story, really, simpler than the legends would suggest. But simple stories were often the truest ones, the ones that resonated, because they reflected universal truths about character and choice and consequence. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Silas went inside to prepare his evening meal. Tomorrow would bring new work and new challenges, as every day on a ranch inevitably did. But he would face those challenges as a free man working his own land, answerable to nobody except himself and the obligations he chose to accept. It had taken 53 years, 3 donkeys, and 1 extraordinary series of events to get here. But Silas Jones had finally arrived at the destination he'd been seeking his entire adult life. And it felt exactly right. The winter that followed was hard, as mountain winters always were. Snow came early and stayed late, piling up in drifts that made even simple tasks difficult. But Silas had prepared well, and his small ranch weathered the season without major losses. The cattle stayed healthy in the shelter of the barn during the worst storms. The horses adapted to the cold with thick winter coats. The donkeys proved remarkably resilient, thriving even when the temperature dropped well below freezing. Spring brought new life and new possibilities. Silas watched with satisfaction as several of his cows gave birth to healthy calves that would form the foundation of his growing herd. He expanded his operation carefully, always staying within his means, never overextending himself the way he'd seen so many other ranchers do in pursuit of rapid growth that led to rapid failure. By the time the anniversary of that fateful day in Copper Ridge arrived, Silas Jones had transformed from a broke ranch hand with no prospects into a successful small rancher with a solid future. He marked the occasion quietly, with no celebration or announcement, just a moment of private reflection about how much can change in a single year when circumstances and character align in unexpected ways. He never forgot the lesson of those 3 donkeys and that single silver dollar. Never forgot how close he'd come to death multiple times. Never forgot the choice he'd made to do the right thing, even when the easy thing had been clearly available. Those memories shaped how he lived going forward, with gratitude for what he had, with integrity in his dealings with others, with generosity toward those who needed help the way he'd once needed it. He gave work to men who were down on their luck, remembering when he'd been in that position himself. He dealt fairly with neighbors and competitors alike, building a reputation for honesty that made him valued and trusted throughout the region. The 3 donkeys lived out their days on his ranch, cared for and comfortable, never again asked to carry anything more significant than occasional supplies or equipment. They became something of a local curiosity as the story of their role in the Silver Falls case spread and evolved, and visitors occasionally came to see the donkeys that carried $50,000 as if the animals themselves were somehow remarkable rather than just ordinary creatures that had been in the wrong place at the right time. Silas always greeted those visitors politely, answered their questions patiently, but never embellished the story or made himself out to be more than he was, a man who'd gotten lucky, made good choices, and built a decent life from those circumstances. He had no interest in being a legend or a character in exaggerated tales. He was content to simply be Silas Jones, rancher, living quietly in the high country and working his land with steady competence. As the years passed and his hair grew grayer and his joints grew stiffer, Silas sometimes reflected on the strange path his life had taken. All those years of working for other men, barely scraping by, never quite getting ahead no matter how hard he worked. And then, in a single evening, everything had changed because he'd had exactly $1 when a desperate stranger needed to sell 3 donkeys. $1. That's what it had cost to set in motion the series of events that had transformed his entire existence. Not skill, not planning, not superior intelligence or virtue, just being in a particular place at a particular time with the tiny amount of money needed to make a purchase that nobody else wanted to make. But what he'd done after that purchase, that was where his character had mattered. He could have run with the money, could have accepted Clayton Morris's offer and walked away with $5,000, could have made a dozen different choices that would have been easier or safer or more immediately profitable. Instead, he'd chosen the harder path, the more dangerous path, the path that required faith in institutions and authorities he had every reason to distrust based on his life experience, and that choice had made all the difference. It was a lesson Silas tried to pass on to the young men who worked for him, though he suspected they didn't fully understand it yet. They would, eventually, when they were older and had faced their own difficult choices. They'd remember the old rancher who'd once bought 3 cursed donkeys for $1 and discovered that doing the right thing, even when it was hard and dangerous, could lead to rewards that money alone could never purchase. Peace of mind, self-respect, the solid satisfaction of knowing you'd faced a test of character and passed it. Those were the real treasures Silas had gained from his extraordinary experience, and they were worth more than any amount of stolen currency. As the sun set on another day in the high country, Silas Jones stood on his porch one final time, looking out across the land he'd worked so hard to build and maintain. The 3 donkeys grazed peacefully in the evening light, casting long shadows across the grass. The cattle moved slowly toward the barn for the night. The mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was right. And for a man who'd spent most of his life feeling like things were never quite right, that simple certainty was the greatest gift of all. The story of the cowboy who bought 3 donkeys for $1 would continue being told long after Silas was gone, growing and changing with each telling until it bore little resemblance to the actual events. But that was fine. Stories existed to entertain and inspire, not necessarily to preserve perfect accuracy. What mattered, what truly mattered, was that Silas Jones had lived the real story with honor and integrity, had made choices he could be proud of, and had built a life worth living from the unexpected opportunities those choices had created. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.